The thought that my mother-in-law won't be here for a long time is a comfort. I took some paid time off to spend an overnight away from our house, where I reside with my in-laws, because my youngest brother was getting married. My mother-in-law's voice called after me as I was packing my overnight bag for the celebration. It had been long since I had done that. "Never come back, and while you're at it, why don't you just get a divorce and leave?" I said coolly, smiling subtly in acceptance of her malice. I left her snide comments behind and left the house. I stopped to say goodbye to our house before going too far. "I appreciate all that you have done. It has been a while. My mother-in-law never gave me any attention, but for some reason I feel really carefree." Carrying a somewhat big luggage, I hurried to the location where my dear family was waiting for me. The hotel would be my home for 3 days and 2 nights. My mother-in-law is unaware that I will never return to this place, so what happens next is still a secret. I'm Selena Jason, a 48-year-old part-time employee who balances managing our hectic home with office work. We met via an acquaintance and have been married for more than 30 years. My husband Dean and I are both 48 years old. Even though our relationship was arranged, we get along well and have similar ideals. Dean's career as a sailor presents the only difficulty because it frequently requires him to spend more than a year away from home. We are fortunate to have a son, and our connection is still good. Up until recently, we resided with my in-laws, mostly taking care of Dean's grandma. I primarily took care of her on my own, using my money to pay a caretaker during the day. This arrangement remained in place until the death of my grandmother-in-law. My eyes welled up with emotions as Dean said how much she appreciated the attention I gave her. She spent her last years in the company of great-grandchildren and other offspring, and received excellent care. Dean is typically away from home for extended periods of time due to his profession. Although living with my in-laws has been difficult, I'm proud of the important job he has done in American logistics. My mother-in-law behaved very differently after the death of her grandma. She used to attempt to appease me by talking kindly to me while putting all the caring duties on me. But once I stopped providing care, she started to utterly disregard me. When she went out, she would purposefully leave me out of her treasures and purposefully run into me when we passed each other within the home. Her blatant animosity startled and unsettled. During his stay, my son Russell said, "Hey, Grandma started saying nasty things again." I was the target of significant charges by my mother-in-law when Russell was only 4 or 5 years old. She made up stories to trick Russell, saying my father detested me and that I was cheating. She even claimed that her criticism of me was the reason Dean didn't return home. When I discovered she was telling him such falsehoods, I was astounded. I was doing domestic tasks and worked hard every day. I wasn't cheating. Rather than being upset with me, Dean's absences were caused by his job. That she would persuade a youngster of such things was ridiculous. I was too busy trying to calm down a worried Russell to think about anything else. I was relieved to see Dean come home and chastise my mother-in-law for her actions. Now that Dean is back from his trip, it appears that my mother-in-law is making the most of his absence. Now that the caring is finished, you would think she would have more spare time, but she keeps me busy instead. My life is further complicated by the fact that she insisted on meticulous cleaning and regularly gave me difficult recipes to follow. My mother-in-law recently hosted a drama marathon and invited the local ladies around. I had to clear up the mess of drink spills and food wrappers that had accumulated in the room while they were having fun. It was adding more labor at a hectic time, immediately before supper. I was sweating from the cleanup, so I became more irritated with her for constantly telling me to hurry up and make supper. She said she was too full from the snacks, but when it came time for dinner, she didn't even sit at the table. Russell's complaint that my mother-in-law indicated she didn't like me and that I should go away made me even more irate. Thinking that Dad would understand, he proposed that maybe it would be best if we lived apart from her. After calming down Russell and getting him ready to go back, I felt I wanted to have a serious conversation with Dean as soon as possible. One day, following Russell's departure, I had another issue. All of a sudden, I started to feel sick. I was sweating, my face was heated, and my limbs were freezing. My menopausal symptoms appeared especially bad on that specific day. Since last year, I've been feeling strange, and the doctors have determined that it's menopause. While they were keeping an eye on things without writing prescriptions, there were difficult days. I questioned if the stress my mother-in-law's actions were causing me to feel. My health deteriorated by nightfall, and I found myself resting in my room. My mother-in-law was yelling at me to come to supper when I heard her approaching. It was so bad that I was having trouble simply sitting up. I thought about acting like I was asleep, but she pulled the cover off of me. She clapped her hands and made a supper demand, so I reluctantly sat up. Given that my grandmother-in-law used to manage the kitchen, I reasoned that if she wanted supper, she should prepare it on her own. Lately, though, it's just been me. My mother-in-law hardly ever went into the kitchen other than to set the dishes while Dean was home. Maybe she was just not a good chef. I told her that I was having trouble with menopause and couldn't do the chores today since I was so tired. Since she had experienced menopausal symptoms in the past, I thought she would get it. Her response, though, was everything but empathetic. She snorted and turned a sack over my head, and I screamed a little in the darkened room as things fell down around me. I was nauseous after waking up, but I wasn't sure what it was right away. I discovered a minute later that the fragrance surrounding me was that of potatoes. My mother-in-law had thrown snack crumbs all over me, and the bag she had flipped upside down was almost empty. It was so unexpected that I was taken aback. With a tongue click, she exited the room. I was lying in bed, hurting, getting reprimanded and drenched in crumbs. Rather than being angry, I experienced an odd, almost dreamlike feeling, as though I was seeing something peculiar. My patience was beginning to grow thin. I took a paid leave of absence from work around 6 months later in order to get ready for a trip to my younger brother's wedding. After cohabiting for a few years, he was finally getting married to his girlfriend. Their house is in New York, so I made reservations for a 2-night and 3-day stay at a hotel. Despite my brother's offer to pay, I chose to handle the hotel expenses myself since I wanted to set my own hours. Although it's a modest ceremony with just relatives, I was looking forward to attending because it's a rare opportunity for everyone to be together. I planned a week's worth of meals ahead of time, as I figured no one else would be cooking during my vacation. I told my in-laws about the meals I had made and put in the fridge the evening before we left, during supper. My mother-in-law appeared unhappy, but my father-in-law praised me. "What's the deal with all the fuss? It's your brother's wedding. Why even attend? Isn't this simply a remarriage? Probably nothing noteworthy." She scowled. More than simply a stare, my father-in-law gave her a look. "Actually, both my brother and his partner are getting married for the first time," I corrected her. My mother-in-law seemed to be misinterpreting the situation as she laughed crudely. A first marriage at 40 must indicate a personal issue with him. Even though your brother is young, why is he getting married in style? "Insolent," she said. It seems that she had either forgotten my family's structure or was mistaking my brother for someone else. In actuality, I have 3 brothers, and my youngest brother is still very young considering we are separated by 14 years of age. My youngest brother, who is in his early 30s, is getting married to a woman who is in her 20s. My mother-in-law was insulted by the correction when I told her this. Her next statement was even more snide, comparing the age difference between a parent and child to that of a girlfriend in her 20s. It surprised me that she wouldn't listen. My father-in-law cleared his throat as if he realized what had happened. "She's not just 20. She's in her 20s, I attempted to explain. Their ages barely differ by 4 or 5 years. That seems sensible, doesn't it?" She appeared rather reasonable when we chatted on a video conference lately. I wrapped up our talk with my in-laws and got ready to head out. I made sure I had everything I needed in my bag and prepared a gorgeous attire for the wedding. I heard my mother-in-law speaking loudly and angrily to my father-in-law from the living room. I knew it would be best to avoid any confrontation until after I had left the house as I started to feel angry. I rolled my somewhat overweight bag in the direction of the front entrance the following morning. I was briefly stopped by my mother-in-law's parting remarks. "Never come back, and why don't you just get a divorce?" "Yes, as you wish," I said happily, sounding more composed than I had anticipated. I had long before reached my breaking point, so I must have been more relieved than I knew. Dean helped me prepare for this day, as I had been. My mother-in-law laughed and munched on some nibbles, seemingly oblivious to the circumstances. The amount of food she could consume first thing in the morning surprised me. I chose to go to the station on foot. I turned to look back at the home before continuing and added, I really owe this house a lot, except for my mother-in-law. For a very long time, Dean, Russell, my father-in-law, and my grandmother-in-law have all made this house seem like home. I even feel like I owe the walls and roof, but I don't remember ever needing my mother-in-law's assistance. I feel so silly for some reason. With a somewhat excessive luggage, I hastened to meet my dear family. I was about to move into a new apartment and live alone after spending 2 nights and 3 days at a motel. I met Dean at the wedding location. He was the one we had invited, and when he saw me coming, he gave me a pen and an unsigned divorce document. We decided that signing it would be the last thing we did together as a couple. Many thanks. Together, let's complete it when we return to the hotel. I hope it's acceptable that I reserved a twin room, I added. My brother's marriage today is a sad event, but it also represents a fresh start for us. I promised him that we would disclose the divorce later and that I wouldn't do it in front of everyone today. Dean and I exchanged a warm smile, both of us realizing the momentous step we were about to take. It seemed so weighty to even consider signing that one piece of paper. It represents the dissolution of our more than 30-year marriage. Dean comforted me that being with him had always made me truly happy, so I apologized. I didn't mind that he was frequently away from home for work because he was aware of this from the beginning. Well, except for his mother. Apologize not. You've made a fantastic spouse. I added, let's stay close friends moving forward, with all the affection I could muster. Dean clasped my hand in tears and thanked me once again, bringing tears to my eyes as well. I made the decision to blame my emotions on joy for my brother's wedding. Dean went back to his parents' house by himself the following day. He gave his in-laws an explanation of the circumstances, and at first they were taken aback by the abrupt discussion of divorce. When they heard the whole tale, my father-in-law lost his temper. He yelled, frightening my mother-in-law, "How dare you drive out someone who cared for my mother until the end?" My father-in-law had been a great support and caring partner, even though I had been the one doing most of the physical labor and taking care of my grandmother-in-law. It seems that my father-in-law had secretly grumbled about my mother-in-law's lack of contribution. He went up to her and voiced his complaints. "Since entering the family through marriage, you have never been good at cleaning. You gave birth to our baby, so I remained mute. However, you have taken advantage of my mother's indulgence to avoid lending a hand." "Selena accomplished everything. You're nothing like her," he said. The comparison of her to me made him even more enraged. "You ought to have been the one to depart. It is incomprehensible that we lost a devoted daughter-in-law like Selena who gave us so much. You have made no financial contribution at all." My mother-in-law's stance was undermined when money was brought up. Dean's pay paid for all family costs, and she had never worked outside the home. Even though our family was wealthy, I continued to work because I enjoyed it. My income supported the family by paying for theater tickets, vacations, and special occasion fine meals. These actions were investments in getting me some alone time. "Dean, it's not too late." Seeing the seriousness of the situation, my father-in-law at last advised, "Go apologize and ask Selena to marry you again." Despite her distress and desperation, my mother-in-law was powerless to avert the fallout from her actions. "This is the home I constructed." My father-in-law furiously said, "You need to leave," and started to evict her. With a fit of rage, my mother-in-law screamed and scratched at her tangled hair. Observers found her conduct to be strange and disturbing. "No, I'm not going anywhere. I refuse to be divorced. At this age, how am I meant to live alone?" she said. My father-in-law was physically stronger than her, so he ultimately succeeded in dragging her out of the house despite her struggle. He forcefully closed and locked the door, leaving her to sob loudly, clutching it. The neighbors were frightened by the disturbance and phoned the police. When the police came, my father-in-law opened the door, but his rage lingered for several days. The atmosphere in the house was tight. My father-in-law and mother-in-law avoided one another, and even ran away when they saw each other in the same room. It was as though they were living apart. My father-in-law called a family gathering after his distant daughter was put in an unsustainable circumstance. He said, "I'm going to divorce her. but his daughter objected, expressing compassion for my mother-in-law, which made things more difficult to talk about. Dean described the abuse I was subjected to, including the way my mother-in-law had deceived our kid in order to incite him against me. He talked about my menopausal pain and showed emails from our kid as proof. Having seen it all, my father-in-law voiced his dissatisfaction, saying my mother-in-law had disobeyed his advice to halt her actions and apologize. Dean also brought up how I handled home duties in my grandmother-in-law's care, asking his sister what she would think if her own mother-in-law had acted in the same way. She remained mute when asked which side she would support. Enraged, my mother-in-law bemoaned that her daughter had betrayed her and claimed to have betrayed herself. Her sardonic honesty amused me since, as I discovered, our grandmother was the one who raised us most of the time, something I had always worried about in our family. Mom used to spend a lot of time with her neighbors, chatting about her old days. His sister had looked at my mother-in-law with contempt after learning about the bullying. Ultimately, the only housewives who made a significant contribution were myself and my grandmother-in-law, who I took care of until her death. Despite having 2 kids, my mother-in-law often shied away from cleaning and took pleasure in the advantages with little effort. Her status was undermined when the family ultimately discovered her pattern of carelessness. My mother-in-law halted her tirades, realized her situation, and started crying. Ultimately, compassion prevented a divorce, but my father-in-law is thinking about divorcing her. I told my father-in-law that I would want to meet with him when I heard this. After I left, Dean told me about these incidents. He said, "Dad should have supported Selena from the beginning if he was going to get so upset now. However, I wasn't present, so what could I say?" Sipping his steaming coffee, Dean moaned. We were in our beloved cafe, a spot we had loved since we were little. I selected a soft drink, something I hadn't had in a while, whereas Dean got a coffee. I grinned softly as I heard the specifics of my mother-in-law's shameful actions. "Be kind with yourself. Your crucial work required you to be gone. You are relied upon by many." My words of support were sincere. It is wonderful that Dean, while being gone for years at a time, supports people via marine transportation in his capacity as a sailor. I apologize for this inconvenience, but that's why I've been putting up with it. You have my continued admiration and respect, yet I am unable to stay in your parents' household. I at last said what had been on my thoughts for a very long time. Though he seemed a little dejected, Dean nodded in agreement. I was relieved that he did not blindly support his parents. I couldn't help but grin widely, and Dean gave me an obviously amazed look. Dean later said that he believed my smile was brighter than it had ever been at that very time. Dean also seemed more endearing than ever to me. Going back to the original narrative, Dean assisted me in seeing his father the day following our cafe meeting. It was time for my last bit of retaliation. Dean's father was dressed more elegantly than usual when he showed up at the cafe. I briefly discussed the weather before getting right to the point. "Dean told me that you're thinking about divorcing your wife. It's doable while you're still well, but after all this chaos, managing it on your own will be difficult. I'm willing to assist with your latter years of care if you do decide to split." This obviously thrilled his father. Dean could spend a lot of time at sea, and his sister resided far away. He had never been one to help out around the house with cooking, cleaning, or washing, so after seeing his mother through to the end, he would definitely be grateful for my assistance. He crossed his arms and scowled, saying, "Of course, I'll separate from her. No, hold on. Perhaps getting a divorce would be better." I hoped my mother-in-law would be fully removed from the matter since she was quite likely to be removed. Her circumstances looked to be getting worse. If I were to suddenly pass away, she'd probably make a huge fuss, he thought. It's better to divorce her properly before that happens. Dean seemed to steel himself as his father talked with increasing determination. Once he makes up his decision, his father usually follows through on it, sometimes going a little too far, but that's just his personality. After years of cohabiting with him, I smiled and nodded in accord, knowing how to handle him. This kind of little prodding would probably get him to follow through. Dean laughed and saw what I was trying to do, but he didn't step in. He appeared to be much more irritated than I was by my mother-in-law's actions. Suddenly full of energy, His father sprang up to get the divorce papers. I chose to help him out of goodwill by introducing him to the attorney Dean, and I had consulted for our divorce. My mother-in-law was doomed to live a lonely existence after that day, since my father-in-law aggressively pursued the divorce. After a week, I went back to my old house, which was now simply my ex-in-law's place. I went to get possessions that I had previously been unable to take. Even though I had removed the most of the items, there were still clothing, books, sentimental mementos, drawings from my son's early years, bedding, and furniture that I had paid for with my own money. I had gathered a lot of personal belongings in the residence over the years. I ended up seeing my mother-in-law for the last time on this visit. She was clearly in a panic as her divorce had already been settled by that point. She knelt in front of me as I collected my possessions, her face pale, and she started apologizing. "Margaret, I sincerely apologize. I ask you, please, it was a joke. Kindly return and convince your spouse." I ignored my mother-in-law's pleadings and kept packing. She got to her feet quickly, insulting me and going back to her old ways, furious at my lack of interest. "How can you disregard me when I'm acting so modestly? Since being a member of this family, you have only caused problems. Simply depart and pass away by yourself." She barked and spit at me after hurling a string of less complex, unrepeatable slurs. I ignored her again and concentrated on putting my belongings in a cardboard box. She let out a sudden cry and rushed towards the box. She turned the box of beautifully folded garments over, and I ducked, startled. She had a fit, kicking and stomping the clothing, scattering them across the floor. "Enough!" With a scowl at his mother, Dean yelled. His normally submissive kid had grown into a powerful figure. His mother was surprised, despite his habit of complying. I turned to my mother-in-law and held Dean back with one hand while maintaining a neutral look. "I am not your daughter-in-law anymore. You are not my mother-in-law anymore. We are no longer in a relationship. I'm grateful for nothing. It was not you, but your father-in-law and mother that assisted me." I hurried over the jumbled garments and stuffed them into the box without folding any of them. "Strange. Don't touch my belongings. Farewell." With a final remark directed at my messy mother-in-law, I hurried out of the room, ready to be away from her. I gave Dean a call to take care of the stuff that was left. I waited for my brother to go after getting into his car. My mother-in-law was still screaming inside the home, but I wasn't going to waste time listening. I heard her weep in sorrow and keep beating her own head after we departed. She appeared to regret cutting off her final hope, but there was never going to be a possibility for reconciliation. Sadly, it was too late for her regrets to be significant. My mother-in-law was ultimately forced to move out and started living alone in a small apartment about a month later. Every now and again, Dean and his sister stop over to see how she's doing. I've heard that she resides indoors most of the time, hardly takes a shower, and wears her old clothing as pajamas. She spends her days eating cheap snacks and fast food and complaining about how poor her life is. Even though she and my father-in-law divided some assets during the divorce, it wasn't much, which meant she would be financially unstable as she aged. Personally, I'm not offering any assistance. Is that not evident? Dean's mother was always proud of him because he was a well-paid sailor. It never occurred to her that her own kid might cut her off altogether. Ironically, she is now the one who is unable to return, despite having previously advised me to leave and obtain a divorce. Similar to the proverb, "Curses return upon those who curse," my mother-in-law ought to have been prepared to deal with her own bad luck if she cast bad luck wishes on other people. I live a quiet life with my cat in an apartment approximately 30 minutes away from my former in-laws' house, 5 years after the divorce. I choose this location since it would make my commute to work easier. The rental is a nice property with plenty of sunlight and pet friendliness. Every week, I still go see my ex-father-in-law and make him different meals. Since the divorce, our relationship seemed to have improved. Considering how much I still assist out, my distant sister-in-law can scarcely meet my sight. Dean and I communicate frequently. We make it a point to go on dates as soon as he gets back from his lengthy maritime travels. It's like opening a fresh chapter. Though we are relatively new to this, we like going to movies and museums, and our relationship seems new and exciting. We find it quite delightful to talk and communicate for hours on end. On his days off, Russell comes over to visit and makes jokes about our fake divorce, joking that you two just went back to being lovers, didn't you? However, the fact is that Dean and I never had a romantic relationship in the first place. Our marriage was planned. We seem to be developing a love relationship for the first time right now. We even have a covert agreement that says we will remarry if we are ever totally freed from his mother, whether she dies, moves in with his sister, or enters a facility. Dean proposes that this would be the point at which his mother would no longer require welfare checks. Talks have already started on whether his sister and her husband would put her in a facility or begin living with her. Our get-together could not be too far off. It seems a little awkward to discuss, but after more than 30 years together, and as we approach our 50s, I'm excited about the possibility of falling in love with Dean, for whom I've always had a great deal of affection.